Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into something the source material calls gravity. They also describe it as the magnet chain for Web3.
Yeah, magnet chain. It's definitely a pretty evocative name right off the bat.
Absolutely. So our mission today, really, is to take all the details provided directly by the project, in their own documentation and announcements, pull out the most important bits, and really try to understand what gravity is.
Right. What are its core claims about performance, its potential, what's the tech they say is behind it, and, where's it supposedly heading?
Exactly. And they make some, well, truly ambitious technical claims. We're talking unparalleled speed, scaling. So let's try and figure out what that all actually means for you.
Sounds good. Where do we start? The basics.
Yeah, let's start with the foundational description. According to the material, what exactly is gravity?
Okay, so it's described as an ultra-fast parallel EVM layer 1 blockchain. And importantly, it's being built by Galxe.
Right, that Galxe connection seems pretty key, doesn't it? Especially when they talk about their main goal being engineered for mass adoption.
Yeah, they tie it directly to potentially tapping into, I think the figure was, plus 25 million users in the Gravity ecosystem. So they're clearly looking at leveraging that existing Galxe user base.
That's the scale they're aiming for,
Yeah.
explicitly. Huge numbers.
And, well, to even think about handling that kind of scale, the project leads with some genuinely headline-grabbing performance claims. They talk about unparalleled speed and scalability.
Okay, specifics. What numbers are they putting out there?
They're specifically mentioning aiming for 1 gigas per second throughput and sub-second finality.
Okay, wow. 1 gigas per second throughput and sub-second finality. Now, for you following the blockchain space, these metrics are vital for mass adoption. But what's the real significance here? What do these numbers actually imply?
Well, what's fascinating is just the sheer ambition in those figures, right? Sub-second finality, that means transaction confirmation in less than a second. For a user, that's basically instant. It removes that waiting, that uncertainty you get on slower chains.
Yeah, instant feedback is huge for user experience.
Definitely. But the 1 gigas per second throughput claim, that's where things get particularly interesting. Throughput, it's often measured in gas units per second, like on Ethereum. It tells you the network's processing capacity.
And a gigas is a billion gas units.
A billion, yeah. Now, translating gas costs exactly across different EVM chains isn't always straightforward, but claiming a billion gas units per second, that suggests a theoretical capacity that's, well, orders of magnitude higher than most EVM chains running today.
So the insight here isn't just it's fast, but the scale of the problem they're claiming to solve. Handling activity levels way beyond what we see now.
Exactly, that's the implication. They're positioning themselves for a future with vastly more activity.
Okay, so the vision is clear. Tap in at Galxe's, aim for mass adoption, promise extreme speed and capacity. But how? How do they claim they'll achieve this? What's the tech described under the hood?
The documentation points to a couple of core technical choices. First, they mention using a pipelined AptosBFT consensus engine that's labeled for optimized performance.
Pipelined AptosBFT, okay. And then there's the other piece, what they call Grevm, or Gravity EVM.
Right, Grevm, Grevm. In one announcement, it's explicitly called the ultra-fast engine powering Gravity's 1 gigasecond performance. It's described as a parallel EVM runtime.
Okay, parallel EVM. We know traditional EVMs, like Ethereum's main one, process transactions one after another sequentially. What does a parallel EVM, like they claim Grevm is, try to do differently to hit those crazy speed targets?
Yeah, this really gets to a critical point about scaling the EVM. A traditional EVM is like a single-lane highway, right? Everything goes through one point. A parallel EVM tries to, well, add more lanes.
Allowing multiple transactions to execute at the same time.
Exactly, or at least parts of transactions, if they're independent. The big challenge, of course, is managing dependencies, making sure that if two transactions touch the same thing, like an account balance, they happen in the right order and don't mess each other up.
So Grevm is presented as their specific way of solving that dependency problem to allow for concurrent execution.
That's the idea presented, yes.
Yeah.
It's their implementation designed to enable that massive claimed throughput. And combining that parallel execution engine with a consensus mechanism like AptosBFT, which itself is known for aiming at high throughput and low latency.
They're trying to optimize performance at multiple layers, basically, consensus and execution.
Precisely. And that word pipeline in AptosBFT suggests they're further optimizing how blocks are proposed and agreed upon, sort of overlapping the steps to cut down latency even more.
Okay, so speed optimization on multiple fronts.
Sure.
What about security? The docs mentioned restaking-powered parasecurity. What's that about?
Yeah, described as built-in resilience. They state it maintains POS security through restaking technology. For you familiar with the space, restaking is that concept of reusing already staked assets, often staked ETH, to secure other networks or protocols besides the original one.
Right, like eigenlayer pioneered.
Exactly. So this potentially allows Gravity to sort of bootstrap its security. They could
Yeah.
tap into these large pools of existing staked capital, aligning economic security without needing to build up a massive native stake pool from scratch immediately.
Makes sense. Leverage existing security.
Okay, so beyond the core tech for speed and security, the material also seems to put a really strong emphasis on like seamless interaction and building a big ecosystem.
Definitely. They highlight something called omnichain intent, calling it seamless interoperability. Omnichain intent sounds like it's about making cross-chain stuff easier for the user.
That's the idea. Instead of you having to manually bridge assets, swap them on different chains, figure out the sequence, you just state your goal, your intent. Like, I want to swap USDC on Ethereum for SOL on Solana and stake it.
And the protocol figures out how to do that behind the scenes, across chains.
Apparently, yes. The underlying protocol handles the complex steps across the different chains needed to fulfill your intent. It's meant to abstract away the cross-chain complexity.
Okay, that sounds powerful if it works smoothly. And this omnichain approach, combined with the high performance they're aiming for, that's presented as empowering developers, right?
Exactly. The docs say developers are empowered to create a variety of innovative solutions for Web3 users. And they actually give some concrete examples of what they think their architecture enables.
Like what?
One example is balance abstraction with yield. The description says their native omnichain intent protocol enables a yield-enabled unified balance across all chains.
So like you'd see one total balance for your assets across multiple chains, maybe even earning yield automatically, without you managing each chain separately.
That seems to be the concept, yeah. Facilitating seamless cross-chain transactions and verifications to make that happen, hiding the complexity.
Okay, a unified yield-bearing balance. That would certainly simplify things. What was the other example? Something about loyalty points.
Right, on-chain loyalty points. The argument in the documentation is that the scalability and low transaction cost Gravity is aiming for would allow developers to take traditional loyalty programs and put them fully on-chain.
Why would they want to do that?
Well, the claim is it minimizes friction and maximizes transparency. The idea is that processing potentially millions of loyalty point transactions would actually be feasible and cheap on their network, which might not be the case on others.
Makes sense. High volume, low value transactions become viable. And critically for adoption, I assume they also mentioned being EVM compatible.
Yes, very important. Noted as enabling seamless interactions. This is key for attracting existing developers and projects from the huge Ethereum ecosystem. Solidity devs, existing dApps, they could potentially migrate or build on Gravity much more easily.
Okay, so we've got the ambitious claims, the core tech ideas, Grevm, AptosBFT, restaking, and these features aimed at usability and ecosystem building, like omnichain intent and EVM compatibility, all based on their materials, of course. Now, how do they actually plan to roll this out? The roadmap they presented seems, well, interesting. It's got a distinct two-phase approach.
Yeah, this is where the strategy gets particularly noteworthy, I think. The documentation lays out a clear plan, but with two quite different major steps.
Okay, tell us about the first one. What's coming soon?
For Q3 2024, so pretty soon, they plan the Gravity Alpha Mainnet launch. Now, the documentation is really crucial here in stating exactly what this is. It's described as an Ethereum rollup powered by Arbitrum Nitro Stack.
Hold on. An Ethereum rollup using Arbitrum tech. So the Alpha Mainnet isn't the layer one they described earlier with the custom pipeline AptosBFT and the native Grevm.
No, exactly. That's the key distinction the documentation makes. The final layer one, the one with all those unique components we discussed, that comes later.
When is that planned?
According to the material, the second stage is the Q4 2025 Gravity Mainnet launch. And this launch is described as the restaking-powered PS Layer 1. That's the one incorporating their custom consensus and parallel EVM.
Okay, Q4 2025, over a year after the alpha.
Right. And they also note this later Layer 1 version will also integrate Reth as its EVM execution engine. Reth is known as a high-performance Ethereum execution client.
So just to recap this, because it's quite unique, they plan to launch first as an Ethereum Layer 2 rollup, specifically using Arbitrum's Nitro tech stack. in Q3 2024. Then over a year later, in Q4 2025, they plan to launch what sounds like a completely different network, a standalone Layer 1 with its own POS consensus secured by restaking, using their custom Grevm, potentially integrated with Reth.
That is precisely what the source material outlines, yes. A two-stage rollout with fundamentally different architectures.
And this, well, it naturally raises a pretty big question for you as someone watching this space, right? Especially given their ambitious goals and how crowded the L1, L2 landscape is. What are the implications of tackling it this way, this two-phase approach?
It's a really interesting strategy. Starting as an Arbitrum-powered rollup, it lets them get to market relatively quickly, right? They can leverage Ethereum's security, which is massive, and the Arbitrum Nitro stack is, battle-tested technology known for being quite efficient.
So that gives them an immediate place for developers and users to land.
Exactly. But as the documentation shows, the long-term vision is this separate Layer 1 chain. It has its own consensus, the AptosBFT thing, its own security model with restaking, and their custom parallel EVM, Grevm, using Reth. So the key insight for you, whether you're a developer or user considering this, is understanding these are two distinct technical environments.
Different underlying tech, different security assumptions.
Right. And the transition, or maybe coexistence, between the roll-up phase and the eventual Layer 1 phase, well, that presents its own set of challenges and opportunities. How does migration work? Are they separate products? That path needs clarity.
It's definitely a phased approach that requires, let's say, careful consideration if you're looking to build or get involved long-term. The documentation also includes some basic getting started steps for right now for the alpha phase.
Yeah, things like bridge to Gravity Alpha Mainnet, add the Gravity network to your wallet, and start exploring the ecosystem and dApps that launch there.
And they also make a point of mentioning significant backing, stating they are backed by the industry's most trusted investors. They also highlight recent announcements releasing their light paper, forming a $50 million ecosystem VC alliance, and unveiling Grevm 1.0.
Yeah, those points from the material are clearly meant to paint a picture of project momentum, funding, and ongoing technical development.
Okay, I think that gives us and you a much clearer picture based purely on the documentation they've put out. Gravity is presenting this big vision for mass adoption, leaning heavily on the Galxe ecosystem connection.
Driven by claims of extreme speed that 1 gigas per second sub-second finality achieved through tech like their parallel EVM, Grevm, and a pipelined AptosBFT consensus.
Secured by restaking, at least in the long-term plan, plus features like omnichain intent for usability.
And crucially, that very distinct rollout strategy. Starting as an Ethereum rollup using Arbitrum Nitro in Q3 2024, with the standalone Layer 1 vision planned for Q4 2025.
Exactly. We've distilled the core claims, the described tech approach, and that unique rollout plan presented in their material.
Yeah, it's quite a package they're presenting.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider, based only on what we've seen in the source material. Given those really ambitious technical targets and this specific two-stage launch strategy rollup first, then a very different Layer 1 over a year later, how might that particular path impact Gravity's journey towards actually achieving mass adoption and, frankly, competing effectively in the incredibly busy blockchain space we see today?
Yeah, that's definitely something to mull over as you process this deep dive.